My name is Lauren Mitchell. I am 29 years old, and I will never forget the night my parents proved beyond any doubt that I was nothing more than an afterthought in their carefully constructed world of favoritism and tradition. It was supposed to be a family celebration, a gathering in honor of my younger brother Ethan, who had just turned 26. The living room was filled with relatives, voices rising in excitement, the smell of champagne corks lingering in the air, cameras flashing as if some celebrity had arrived, and right there in the middle of it all, my parents held out a set of shiny silver keys tied with a silk ribbon and announced to everyone that they were giving Ethan a brand new house. The applause was thunderous. My aunt dabbed her eyes with a napkin, my uncle slapped Ethan on the back, and my father's voice boomed with pride as he declared that his son, his heir, finally had a place worthy of carrying the family name. I stood off to the side, trying to steady the paper plate in my trembling hand, watching as Ethan hugged them, kissed my mother on the cheek, and lifted the keys high like some kind of trophy. Then, as if to include me in this grotesque theater of favoritism, my mother turned toward me with a smile too sweet to be real, pressed a thin white envelope into my hands, and whispered, "We didn't forget you, Lauren." I tore it open, expecting maybe a small token of recognition, a gift card, a framed picture, anything that might signal I mattered, but inside there was nothing except a crumpled $5 bill. $5 for a daughter who had worked since she was 16 to help pay the mortgage. $5 for the child who had taken out loans to put herself through college while Ethan's tuition was covered in full $5 for the woman who had been the invisible scaffolding of this family, holding everything together while they poured their praise and resources into their golden boy. I felt the heat rise in my chest, my ears ringing with the sound of laughter around me, as if the whole room had seen what was in that envelope and decided it was a joke worth sharing. My father leaned back in his chair, swirling his glass of whiskey, and said loud enough for everyone to hear, "Con trai moi, la chukot quadzadin con gai ti samuant kum teo chum." My relatives chuckled, some nodded in agreement, and I could feel my face burning, as though someone had pressed a branding iron against my skin. Ethan came over grinning, dangling the keys in my face like a medal, and said, "Don't worry, sis. You can crash in my guest room if life gets too rough." His tone was casual mocking, and the room erupted again in polite laughter that cut deeper than any insult ever could. In that moment, I realized I was not simply being overlooked. I was being humiliated, diminished in front of every witness my parents had assembled, and the message was crystal clear. My worth in their eyes amounted to $5 crumpled and a lifetime of sacrifice they would never acknowledge. I clenched that bill in my fist, the edges digging into my palm, and forced a smile so tight it made my jaw ache, while inside me something began to crack, a fracture that would soon widen into a chasm. No amount of family guilt or empty words could ever close again. When I drove home that night with the $5 bill still crumpled in my fist, I could not escape the flood of memories that rose up uninvited each one. Another reminder that this was not some isolated insult, but a lifetime of being measured against Ethan and found wanting. I remembered being 10 years old, standing in our driveway on a humid summer afternoon, the smell of charcoal from the neighbor's barbecue in the air, when my father wheeled out a gleaming red bicycle with chrome handlebars and shouted for Ethan to come outside. Ethan shrieked with delight, hopped on, and rode down the street while relatives clapped and cheered. When it was my turn, my mother placed a small cardboard box in my hands, and inside was a doll from the discount store, its hair already tangled, its dress crooked, its plastic body smelling faintly of chemicals. I forced a smile as my parents snapped photos of Ethan pedaling proudly while no one even asked me to hold up my doll. At 12, the pattern deepened. Ethan's birthday party filled the backyard with balloons, catered food, and a rented bounce house that made our neighbors jealous. My birthday, a few months later, was celebrated with a store-bought sheet cake placed on the kitchen counter. No guests except a few cousins and my parents, repeating the same phrase they always used. "We need to save money, Lauren, you understand." At 16, when I received my acceptance as valedictorian, a letter that should have made my parents beam with pride, they did not even attend the ceremony. Instead, they were in the bleachers at Ethan's basketball championship, waving banners, screaming his name, telling me later that sports scholarships matter more than speeches. I still remember standing in my graduation gown, clutching the medal around my neck, searching the crowd for their faces, and finding nothing but empty seats. At 18, when college became reality, Ethan's tuition was fully covered without hesitation. He was sent to UCLA with a brand new laptop, a furnished dorm, and a steady flow of spending money. I was told to take out student loans, to work nights at a diner, to be proud of my independence. I sent home money for my tips, thinking that maybe, just maybe, they would see how much I was sacrificing, but the only thing they ever said was, "You're strong, you can handle it, Lauren. Your brother needs more support." I tried to believe them. I tried to see my own strength as something admirable, a badge of honor, but the truth was that I was carrying weight no 19-year-old should bear. I was exhausted, falling asleep in lectures, scraping together rent, yet every holiday when I came home, I was treated as if I had failed some invisible test, as if my hard work counted less than Ethan's easy victories. At 22, when I graduated with honors, despite juggling 2 jobs, they didn't throw me a party. They sent a card with a $50 bill inside and a note that said, "We are so proud of Ethan's promotion at the firm." He had barely worked 6 months in a position my father's friend had arranged, yet his picture was framed in the living room while my diploma gathered dust in a cardboard box. Year after year, the message never changed. Ethan deserved everything I deserved, scraps. There were moments I let myself hope, moments I thought maybe they would notice, maybe I would finally matter. Like the Christmas I saved for months to buy my mother a pearl necklace, wrapping it carefully in velvet, imagining her tears of gratitude. She opened it, smiled politely, and immediately turned to gush over the smartwatch Ethan had bought her with my father's credit card. Or the summer I drove 3 hours to surprise my father with tickets to his favorite baseball team, only to have him cancel at the last minute because Ethan needed help moving into his new apartment. Every time I extended my hand, hoping for acknowledgement, I was slapped with indifference. And the worst part was that I convinced myself it was temporary, that one day my sacrifices would add up, that my parents would finally look at me and see a daughter worthy of love, not just duty. But that night, staring at the $5 bill, I realized the truth. I had been running from all my life. It was never going to change, because in their eyes, I was not the child who carried their legacy. I was simply the daughter who could be used and forgotten. By the time I turned 29, I had built a life for myself brick by brick, a life that stood not because of my parents, but in spite of them, and yet their shadows still reached me, reminding me of every slight, every insult. I worked as a financial analyst at a mid-sized law firm, a job I had clawed my way into by studying late nights, passing exams while drinking cheap coffee, and never asking anyone for a handout. I had saved enough to buy a modest condo in the outskirts of the city. Not glamorous, but mine, a space where every item, every piece of furniture had been earned with my own effort. It should have been enough to prove my worth, but whenever family gatherings came, the comparisons returned like clockwork. My mother would look around my condo, purse her lips, and say things like, "It's nice, but it feels temporary, don't you think? You'll move when you marry." My father would chuckle. "A woman doesn't need property, Lauren. That's for men to handle." I would swallow my pride, force a smile, and tell myself to let it slide. But the night of Ethan's housewarming party destroyed whatever fragile tolerance I had left. My parents had invited the entire extended family, neighbors, colleagues, anyone who could serve as an audience for their spectacle. The new house gleamed under strings of fairy lights, champagne glasses clinked, and Ethan in his tailored suit walked around like a king surveying his kingdom. My parents beamed beside him, their pride swelling with every guest that congratulated them on raising such a successful son. I stood by the corner with my cousin Marcy, who whispered, "They're about to make some big announcement." I laughed nervously, thinking maybe they would finally acknowledge me too. Maybe they would say something about my condo, my job, my independence. Instead, the moment came when my father tapped his glass with a spoon, called for silence, and lifted a small velvet box containing the keys. He handed them to Ethan with a flourish, declaring, "This is our gift to our son, the future of this family, the man who will carry us forward." The crowd erupted in cheers. My mother cried into her handkerchief. Ethan waved the keys like a conquering hero. Then, as if remembering, I existed. My mother pressed a white envelope into my hands and urged me to open it. I tore it carefully, feeling dozens of eyes on me, and when the single $5 bill slipped out into my palm, a ripple of laughter spread through the room. My father leaned back smirking and said, "You can use that to buy yourself something nice, Lauren." Ethan strolled over, twirling the keys, and added, "If things ever get hard in that little condo of yours, don't worry, you can always crash at my place. It's big enough." His voice carried just enough mockery to sting, and the guests chuckled politely, pretending not to notice the humiliation burning across my face. I wanted the floor to swallow me whole, but instead I forced my lips into a brittle smile while my insides twisted with shame and rage. In that instant, I realized this wasn't just favoritism, it was a performance, a deliberate act staged to elevate Ethan and belittle me before witnesses. They didn't just forget me, they wanted everyone to see how little I mattered. The humiliation was public, brutal, and complete. And though I stayed through the rest of the party answering empty questions, sipping watered-down punch, my mind was already unraveling, preparing for the breaking point I could no longer avoid. When the last guest had left and the fairy lights outside Ethan's house flickered in the wind, I slipped away without saying goodbye. My hands clenched so tight around the $5 bill that my nails left crescents in my palm. I drove through the dark streets with the radio off, the silence pressing in on me, headlights from passing cars slicing across my face like blades. It was nearly 2 in the morning when I pulled into a deserted gas station and killed the engine, my breath coming in ragged bursts, as if my own chest had turned against me. I sat there gripping the steering wheel, staring at the bill crumpled in my lap, and the flood of rage that rose inside me was so sharp it made my vision blur. $5 for 29 years of sacrifice, for the countless nights I stayed awake studying with tears in my eyes, for the money I sent home when I could barely pay rent, for every time I chose silence instead of screaming when they overlooked me. $5 offered not in kindness but as a cruel joke. A public humiliation designed to remind me that in their eyes I would never be equal to my brother. My phone buzzed with message after message, first from my mother, then my father, and finally Ethan. "Don't make this bigger than it is," one text read. Another said, "Be grateful you got something." Then Ethan's came cruel and casual. "Hope, you didn't spend your $5 all in one place." My chest constricted. My throat burned and tears slid hot down my cheeks. But beneath the hurt was a harder truth, one I could no longer ignore. This wasn't a slip, it wasn't a misunderstanding, it was who they were and who they had always been. They had never seen me as worthy, never planned a future that included me, never believed my achievements mattered. In their world, Ethan was the son who carried the bloodline, the one who deserved houses and celebrations while I was disposable, expected to marry off, fade into someone else's family, vanish. The rage solidified into something colder, sharper, a decision forming like ice in my veins. My hands moved before my mind caught up, opening the messages, pressing down on the block button one by one. Mother, Father, Ethan gone from my phone as if they had never existed. The silence that followed was deafening, but for the first time in my life, it felt like freedom. I tossed the phone onto the passenger seat, smoothed the bill flat against my thigh, and whispered to myself, "Never again." In that moment, under the harsh fluorescent light of the gas station at 2 in the morning, I felt the fracture inside me widen into a clean break, a severing of ties that could never be mended. I knew I was done being their scapegoat, their afterthought, their daughter, only in name. Something inside me had snapped, and though I did not yet know what shape my revenge would take, I knew it would come, and when it did, it would not be quiet. The morning after that humiliating party, I woke up in my condo with swollen eyes and a pounding head, the $5 bill still lying on the nightstand like a piece of evidence mocking me. But instead of crumbling under the weight of it, something inside me hardened. I worked in a law firm, not as a lawyer, but as a financial analyst who combed through balance sheets, property records, and contracts every day. And for the first time in my life, I decided to turn that knowledge against the very people who had dismissed me. I began quietly pulling public property records tracing the purchase of Ethan's house, and within hours I found the first crack. The deed listed my parents as the initial owners, but the funding source was traced back to a family trust created when my grandfather died, a trust in which both Ethan and I had been named equal beneficiaries. My heart pounded as I scrolled through scanned documents and saw a signature that was supposed to be mine, but wasn't. The letters of my name were clumsy imitations, jagged lines that looked nothing like my careful handwriting. My parents had forged my consent to transfer the full share of the trust to Ethan so they could present him with a house while handing me a $5 bill. I printed the documents, my hands shaking, and took them to one of the attorneys at my firm, a woman named Carla, who had mentored me for years. She adjusted her glasses, studied the pages, and looked up with a mix of anger and disbelief. "Lauren, this is fraud. If you want to pursue this, you have a case." My chest tightened, a strange blend of fear and exhilaration flooding me. For years, I had swallowed their cruelty in silence, but here was proof, black and white, that they had not only demeaned me emotionally, but stolen from me financially. Carla connected me with a litigator in the firm who specialized in family and estate disputes, and within days, we filed an injunction freezing the transfer of ownership until the matter could be resolved. The summons went out, and for the first time in my life, my parents could not simply dismiss me with a cruel joke or a guilt-ridden lecture they were forced to answer in court. The fallout was immediate. My phone lit up with furious messages, first from my father calling me ungrateful, accusing me of betraying the family, then from my mother, who wept into voicemail after voicemail saying, "You will ruin us. Lauren, please stop this. We did what was best for Ethan." Ethan himself sent a single text, "You'll regret this." But I ignored them all, my resolve like steel. Weeks later, we stood in a conference room, not a courtroom yet, but a mediation session, and I faced them across a polished oak table. My father's face was red, his fists clenched. My mother dabbed her eyes with tissues, and Ethan sat smugly with his lawyer beside him. Carla laid out the documents, pointing to the forged signature, the altered dates, the diverted funds. The room went silent, except for the sound of paper sliding across the table. My father erupted. "You're going to drag your own family through the mud for money." His voice thundered, but for once it did not shake me. I leaned forward, my voice steady. "No, I'm dragging you here because you stole from me, because you humiliated me, because you decided I was worth $5 while you gave him a house built on both our inheritance. This isn't about money, it's about justice." My mother sobbed. "We thought Ethan needed it more." "You're strong, Lauren. You can manage on your own." My hands trembled, but I forced them flat on the table. Being strong does not mean being exploited. Being a daughter does not mean being disposable. For the first time in decades, I saw a flicker of uncertainty in my father's eyes, the realization that I was no longer his silent child. The mediator adjourned, but the evidence was too clear to ignore. The case moved forward, and when we finally stood before a judge weeks later, the entire extended family filled the benches behind us, whispering as the proceedings began. The judge examined the forged signature, listened to Carla outline the trust, and finally declared, "The trust is equally divided. The transfer to Ethan was unauthorized and invalid. Lauren Mitchell retains a 50% ownership of the property in question." Gasps filled the courtroom. Ethan slammed his fist against the table. My mother wailed, and my father sat stone-faced, his empire of favoritism crumbling under the weight of the law. I walked out of that courthouse with my head high, the $5 bill tucked safely in my wallet, not as a mark of shame anymore, but as a reminder of what I had survived and the strength I had claimed. For the first time, they had no power over me, and the revenge was not loud or violent. It was cold, precise, and legal, exactly the kind of justice they never believed I was capable of demanding. The judgment did not end the war. It only dragged the battlefield into the open, and the confrontation that followed was uglier than I ever could have imagined. A week after the court ruling, we were summoned to a family meeting arranged by an uncle who still believed blood could mend what had been shattered, and I walked into my parents' living room to find the air thick with tension, cousins whispering in corners, aunts clutching their handbags like shields, and Ethan pacing the carpet with rage flickering across his face. My father stood near the fireplace, his jaw tight, a glass of whiskey already in his hand, though it was barely noon, while my mother sat on the couch, eyes red and swollen tissues piled at her side like fallen soldiers. As soon as I entered, every conversation died, all eyes turned, and my father's voice cut through the silence like a blade. "You've humiliated this family, Lauren. You've dragged our name into court, made us look like criminals." His words dripped with venom, but I didn't flinch. I held my ground and replied, "You did that yourselves when you forged my signature and stole what was mine." All I did was refuse to stay silent. My mother clasped her hands, her voice trembling as she pleaded, "Lauren, please, you know we didn't mean harm. We just wanted to secure Ethan's future. You're our daughter, strong and independent. We thought you didn't need as much." My laugh was hollow, sharp. "You mean because I'm a woman, because in your eyes, daughters don't need property. Daughters don't inherit, daughters are supposed to disappear into someone else's house." Admit it, this was never about strength. It was about sexism, about valuing a son above a daughter. The room shifted, whispers rippled, a few relatives nodded grimly. Ethan exploded. "You always think you're better, don't you? With your job, your stupid condo, your attitude. They gave me the house because I deserve it, because I'm the one who matters here." His words echoed the very poison that had been fed to him all his life, and for the first time I didn't see him as just my brother, but as the perfect product of my parents' favoritism entitled Arrogant Blind. I stepped closer, meeting his glare, and said quietly enough that the weight carried through the room, "You matter because they told you you did. I matter because I fought for it, because I refused to accept scraps, because now the law itself says I do. That's the difference between us, Ethan. Your worth is borrowed, mine is earned." My father slammed his glass down, shards of crystal scattering across the hearth, his voice shaking with fury. "If you walk away with this, you are no daughter of mine." The words, intended as a curse, struck me like a liberation. I straightened my shoulders and replied, "Then I'll take that as freedom." My mother wailed, clutching at my arm, but I pulled away, leaving her fingers clawing the air, her sobs filling the room as I turned and walked toward the door. Behind me, the house erupted in chaos, voices shouting, cousins arguing, the carefully polished image of unity dissolving into shouts and broken glass. It was the fallout of decades of lies, favoritism, and neglect, and though it was brutal, it was not my burden anymore. For once, the destruction belonged to them, not me, and I walked into the daylight with my head high, knowing I had faced them, stripped them of their illusion of power, and left them to choke on the truth they had spent a lifetime trying to bury. In the weeks after that final confrontation, the silence from my family was louder than any of their screams had ever been, and for the first time in my life, I discovered what peace actually felt like. The court had ruled in my favor. I legally owned half of Ethan's prized house, and though he raged and sulked eventually, even he could not ignore the judgment stamped with the authority of the law. Rather than fight to live under the same roof with people who despised me, I instructed my lawyer to negotiate a buyout, and within 2 months, Ethan was forced to cut me a check for my share. The number on that piece of paper dwarfed anything my parents had ever spent on me. A validation not just of money, but of worth, and with it I closed the chapter of being their disposable daughter. I used part of that money to pay off my student loans in full, wiping away years of debt that had shackled me, then invested in a new condo in the heart of the city, a place filled with sunlight and space that felt entirely my own. When I carried the keys into that apartment for the first time, I thought back to the night Ethan had waved his keys like a trophy, and I smiled because mine represented something he could never understand, independence earned rather than gifted. I furnished it with care, painting the walls in colors I loved, hanging my diploma in a frame above my desk, placing photos of friends who had stood by me when family had not. And right in the center of the living room, I set a small shadow box containing that crumpled $5 bill. Guests would sometimes ask why it was there, and I would tell them simply, "It reminds me never to accept less than I deserve." But the truth ran deeper, that Bill was my scar and my medal proof of where I came from and what I overcame. Slowly, I built a new circle around me, colleagues who respected my mind, friends who valued my presence, neighbors who offered kindness without strings. Birthdays became dinners with laughter that didn't carry an edge of comparison. Holidays were spent with people who wanted me there, not with those who tolerated me. And though sometimes at night the memories crept back, the empty seats at my graduation, the casual dismissals, the countless times I had begged silently for recognition, I would look at that framed bill and feel relief instead of pain, because I had finally learned that my worth was not something my parents could grant or take away. It was something I claimed and defended with every step I took toward freedom. When I passed Ethan on the street months later, his face pale with bitterness, he did not look me in the eye, and I felt no anger, only clarity. He was trapped in the gilded cage my parents had built for him, dependent on their approval, drowning under their expectations while I was free, unbound, thriving. In the end, my revenge had not been the money or the judgment or even the humiliation. Reversed, it was the life I created beyond their reach, a life in which I was no longer the forgotten daughter, but the author of my own story. And as I stood on the balcony of my new apartment one evening, the city lights shimmering below the framed $5 bill glowing softly behind me, I whispered to myself with a calm certainty I had never known. They gave him a house, they gave me $5, but I built a kingdom out of it, and I am finally free.